Well, with regard to Lois, what she was saying about her first space success was kind of accurate. She was with her young son then, and she was kind of wandering around looking kind of lost. And I was seated at breakfast with Fred Hayes. We were enjoying our oatmeal together, and I invited Lois and Aubrey over and introduced them. And it's amazing how knowledgeable Lois has become about space, and even more amazing about how much Aubrey has grown up.
Yeah.
So
Aubrey is engaged, David.
amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I probably had more hair then, too.
No.
No.
And she's brutally honest.
So my book, I Was a Teenage Space Reporter, was released in the U.S. April 2nd and will be released in the United Kingdom May 2nd. And what I'd like to talk about today, if I can figure out the AV here, is 5 life lessons from the Apollo program. I had a very unique opportunity to cover the Apollo 11 launch as a 19-year-old teenage college journalist. And hopefully I learned something from the experience. And I'd like to, first of all, talk about what it was like covering Apollo 11 as a teenager, and in the first half of the talk, and then in the second half of the talk about some of these lessons that I learned from the experience. I grew up with the space program. I was born in 1950, and I was 7 years old when the Russians launched Sputnik, the first artificial Earth satellite. I was affected at an early age by space, and one of my favorite television shows then was Walt Disney's Disneyland. Now, Disney had cooperated with Werner von Braun, the German rocket scientist and former SS officer, to produce a series of segments for this TV show that really ignited my imagination. It showed astronauts going into Earth orbit, going to a space station, and going to Mars. I was also affected by books as well. The first book I ever owned, which I still have, I received for my 8th birthday, and it was called Space Pilots by Willy Ley. And again, Ley was a German rocket scientist, and he wrote a series of books, and this was my first book that I ever owned. And I started to think about, well, did I have what it takes to become an astronaut? The other influence on me as a young child was science fiction. And I loved the so-called juvenile novels by Robert Heinlein. And my favorite was Have Spacesuit Will Travel. And for those of you who don't know about this delightful book, it's about a teenager who wins a spacesuit in a cereal box contest, and later goes on to save the universe by cooperating with a female sidekick named Pee-wee, and also an alien called the Mother Thing. And if you've never read this, it's a great science fiction book for young kids. Now, so I had interest in space travel and space exploration from an early age. So let's fast forward to when I turned 18 and I started at the University of Michigan as a freshman. In high school, I had been involved in our high school student newspaper as one of the editors. And when I tried to figure out what extracurricular activity to do at Michigan, it was natural for me to consider the Michigan Daily. The Michigan Daily is an independent student-run newspaper at the Ann Arbor campus that was founded in 1890. So it's a very old institution. And Michigan does not have a journalism department, but it's turned out hundreds of journalists who learned the trade through the Michigan Daily. And it was a really important part of my college experience to be a reporter and later managing editor of the Daily. Well, when I entered the Daily in 1968, they were preparing Apollo 7 to be launched as the first manned Apollo flight, which went successfully in October 1968. Now, I was the only person in the Daily at that time that had any interest whatsoever in space or science, okay? They were all humanities majors, political science, philosophy, and here I was someone majoring in zoology who had an interest in space. So when it came time to write an editorial about the first manned Apollo flight, I volunteered, and even though I was a mere freshman, I got the job. And I wrote an editorial called "The Case for Outer Space" that I'm still pretty proud of today, and with a few minor changes could be used today. And so what happened then after Apollo 7 was in December 1968, Apollo 8 flew around the moon. And at that time, I was back in Chicago for Christmas break. I watched the famous Christmas broadcast from the moon, in which the astronauts read the first part of the book of Genesis. And this was really an overwhelming experience, emotional experience for me. And like a lot of people, by the end of the broadcast, I had tears in my eyes. Also, when I was home over Christmas break, I was talking to an old friend of mine, a guy named Marvin Rubenstein, and we had been space friends for many, many years. And he suggested, the summer of '69 is coming up, why don't we go down to the Cape for a launch and see a Saturn V launch? Because we were 18 then, and at that point an 18-year-old could get a motel room, an 18-year-old could drive a car, an 18-year-old at that point could even drink beer. So it seemed like an opportune time to do it. But we knew that there needed to be several successful flights before then. At that time, we had no idea what flight would be the first flight to land on the moon. But when we looked at the NASA schedule, we saw that Apollo 11 was scheduled in July, and this was right in the middle of our college break. So we thought about this. I had gotten a very cushy, easy job selling men's clothing in a fancy Michigan Avenue men's store, okay? But the condition was I could only take a week off. And so we started looking into going down to covering the July launch, and I suggested that we try and get press passes. Now, there's a problem with that. Number one, NASA would not accredit college journalists because they considered them students and not professional journalists. And the other thing is that they had over 3,500 applications for press passes to cover Apollo 11. But we decided to go ahead with our planning, but we wanted to wait until after Apollo 10, because that would determine what the approximate launch date of Apollo 11 would be. And as you know, Apollo 10 was a dress rehearsal for the moon landing, and after that came down successfully the end of May 1969, we went into full gear planning to do this expedition to Cape Kennedy. So the first thing I knew is that the place was going to be mobbed with people. So the day after Apollo 10 landed, I called a couple of places. Now you got to remember, there was no internet then, okay? And there was no Expedia, and it was not easy to make reservations. You had to actually call the place on a rotary telephone. The younger people may not know what that is, but so you would call the place on a rotary telephone and call and make a reservation. So I found this kind of aging motel called the Sea Missile Motel. Again, we did not have a lot of money, so we would not be able to stay at the Cape Kennedy Hilton or any of these other places. So we went to this kind of seedy, low-budget motel called the Sea Missile. You can't see it here, but on the sign in front of it, the big features were TV in every room and air conditioning. So made a reservation, and again, no internet. This is how you got a receipt for a reservation. They sent you a postcard. Okay, and so that postcard is, and again, the postage rate for a postcard then was 5 cents. Okay, so they reserved a room. Now, the room rate at this motel was $10 a night. Okay, but again, you've got to remember inflation, so that would be close to $70 a night now. And so I made a reservation for July 13th through 18th, but later extended it. So that was one part, was having the motel. The other part was getting an airplane ticket. And so I got airplane tickets going from Chicago to Tampa, and then from Tampa to Melbourne. Now, in 1969, the airport at Orlando was not what it is now. Okay? And so people that usually flew to the Cape would fly to this Melbourne airport, which still exists but isn't really used that much. And the round-trip fare was $94.50, which then was a lot of money because, again, that was close to $700 now, $600 to $700. And so for college students, that was a lot. So I knew I had savings from previous summer jobs, but I knew I was going to have to come up with some scheme to make a little bit of money to help cover this. Now, the biggest nut to crack was getting the press passes. I first applied to public affairs at NASA, and I got turned down. But I wasn't going to give up. And it so happened that one of the other editors of the Daily was going to be working in Washington for something called the College Press Service, or CPS. And College Press Service was a group of like 500 college and university newspapers. And he was their summer editor. So he was kind of a friend of mine, and I asked him, I said, can you go to bat for us with NASA Public Affairs to get press passes for myself and my friend? And to make a long story short, he spent like 2 weeks going in there, pestering them, writing them letters, and he was a very persistent guy also. And on June 17th, 1969, I got a letter from him saying that he did it and that 2 press passes would be on the way. I couldn't believe it. We were prepared to go down there without press passes, but I knew that with a press pass it would open up all kinds of doors to us. And so a few days later, I opened the mail, and there it was, a Apollo 11 press pass for me for the College Press Service Wire Network. So the launch was scheduled for July 16th. 3 days before, on July 13th, we went to O'Hare Airport, and standing in line with us there was an older woman who looked very familiar. It turned out that this was Rose Cernan, Gene Cernan's mother. We had recognized her from going to a previous event after Gemini 9. And so we're standing there talking to Rose Cernan, and we get on the plane, we get down there, and there's these 4 guys there who were there to pick her up. The main one was Alan Bean. Cernan couldn't pick his mom up because he was involved in some other activity, but Alan Bean was there to pick up his mom. And then she introduced us to the other astronauts who were there, Jim Irwin, Charlie Duke, and Bruce McCandless. And so we chatted with them a little bit. Of course, our bags were late coming out, and Mrs. Cernan's bags were late coming out. So we were standing out there. There was no bag return. They would bring the bags and put them on a rack outside. So we were standing there with the astronauts, and so I snapped some pictures. We talked with them a little bit more. Jim Irwin took a picture of me with Alan Bean, so we thought that this was perhaps a sign of good luck, that within 20 minutes of landing in Florida, we're with 4 astronauts, 3 of whom would later walk on the moon.
Not bad.
So we took 2 press tours in the days before the launch. I'll just show you a few scenes from these. This was the track crawler transporter here. And to give a sense of scale, you can see on the right side there a guy standing. And this is on the track with crushed gravel. And you can see the vehicle assembly building in the background. And we were able to get within 3/4 of a mile of pad 39A where the Saturn V was standing. So to give you an idea of the size of it, from the base of the rocket all the way to the top, 363 feet. It was attached to the red launch umbilical tower, and there was a gray mobile service structure, which was the gantry around it. We also were able to go into the vehicle assembly building inside, and we were on the floor of it. We actually went up to the roof of the vehicle assembly building, and we're able to look down and we're able to see the top. This was the bottom of the stack of the Apollo 12 Saturn V. By the time we got there in July, it had already been stacked up. And this is the base of it. You can see two of the F1 engines there on either side, and in the middle is one of the huge swing arms. And interestingly, the cover of the swing arm is pulled up. We're not sure exactly why, what type of servicing they were doing on it at this point. But inside, to give an idea of scale, in the middle there, to the left of the swing arm, you can see a couple of technicians in there. And this rocket was just so unbelievably huge.
I wonder if they could turn the lights down.
Hmm?
Can the lights stand at all? Yeah. Can
Not too dim because people will fall asleep.
you?
Yeah.
No. That's so hard to see. No?
The other gentleman.
Other way.
Yeah.
Of that.
Great. That's better.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where the.
And it's the first, you guys know, it's the first time we're using the room. We got the CO like 2 days ago. So the first use of the room. So this is our Apollo 10 here.
We'll get your bugs out.
Yeah. So far so good.
So again, there were 5 of these F1 engines at the base of a Saturn V, the thing of the first stage. And then you can see 2 of them on either side here, and the swing arm in the center there, and the technicians underneath the rocket. We also went on a special tour of the Launch Control Center. This was Firing Room 1, and these were the controllers who were actually working Apollo 11, which was supposed to go off in 2 days. We took this picture from an observation booth that was above. But we were able to actually go to the floor of Firing Room 3, which was not being used at this point. And again, this is something that if you didn't have press pass, you would never ever be able to do, to go to the floor of a firing room. Wait, okay, wait, I'm missing something here. Okay, so this is the consoles, the electronic consoles on the floor of Firing Room 3. And on the right side, that is the launch director's console, okay? And you can see that there were modern phones there, and there were cathode ray tubes were the screens that were present, and there were a bunch of switches and lights. Now, the Saturn V rocket, all the sensors on it, were actually hardwired, each one, into the Launch Control Center. Wow. And if you can imagine that there were like thousands of sensors, and again, each hardwired in here. Each part of the Launch Control Center had a specific area of consoles where it followed, for example, like following the second stage. And so this is looking at some of these consoles then. My friend Jonathan Ward wrote an excellent book called Rocket Ranch about these things. And he was actually able to identify for me what that specific console was. But at the time, this seemed like the ultimate in high tech. Okay? Now it seems almost laughable that we were able to get to the moon with this type of primitive technology. Again, they had computers, but they were mainframe computers that took a whole room, occupied a whole room. The Apollo guidance computer that allowed them to land on the moon, any of your cell phones have more memory and capability than the Apollo guidance computer. The fact that we made it on such relatively primitive technology is amazing. Now, besides tours, we went to a couple of important press conferences. And this was the so-called Centers Director Briefing. These guys were the head of NASA centers. And on the left, you have Werner von Braun, the head of Marshall Space Flight Center, who was responsible for the Saturn V. Next to him was Kurt Diebes, another former German rocket scientist who was the head of the Kennedy Space Center. And next to him in the middle was George Miller. George Miller was Associate Administrator for manned spaceflight, and really one of the unsung heroes of the space program. We later had an opportunity to personally interview him, And he was responsible for many important concepts, including call-up testing, which we'll talk about. And he's really the father of the space shuttle itself. And then next to him is Dr. Robert Gilruth, head of the Manned Spacecraft Center then. And then next to him is a relatively unknown guy, but a guy named John Clark, who was head of Goddard Space Flight Center at that point. Now, at this news conference, von Braun, who was always the most quotable of them, was asked, what's the importance of this flight? And he compared it to amphibians leaving the ocean to live on the land. Now, at the time, I thought that was hyperbole. But as we'll talk about later, I think that was a very, very brilliant statement. Now, the other news conference that we went to involved a remote interview with the Apollo 11 crew. They were in isolation in the Manned Spacecraft Operations Building, which is now called the Armstrong O&C Building. But they had crew quarters in there, and they could not, they were in isolation, so it had to be a remote interview. The press, including myself, was at the Apollo 11 News Center, which was an industrial building, kind of kitty corner to the Cape Kennedy Hilton in Cape Canaveral. And so there were 4 journalists that asked questions, and on the left you see Walter Cronkite, who was the senior guy there. Now, I took that picture. Now, a couple of months ago, I got an email from J.L. Pickering, who is the ultimate guru in space photography. He has the largest private collection of space pictures. And he sent me this picture on the right and said, do you recognize yourself there? And I said, son of a bitch. If you see on the right, there's a guy facing outward, all the way on the right there, and that is me at that news conference.
Bring your back to action.
But looking for the picture, so this was an official NASA photograph of this, and I just happened to be in the crowd.
And you did have hair.
And if anybody could have found it, it was JL. So one of the most amazing sights before the launch was 2 nights before the launch, they took us in a press bus to an observation site just about a mile roughly or so from the launch pad. And as night fell, they shined these high-intensity xenon lights on the rocket. And this picture really doesn't do it justice, but there were beautiful shafts of light going out at different angles, illuminating the rocket. In my notebook, I wrote down a jewel in the night, and it really was spectacular. I didn't have the photographic skills to fully catch the whole thing, but I think this picture gives you some idea of what it looked like. Now, the day before the launch, they moved away the mobile service structure. They moved away the gray gantry. I'm going to just get a sip here. And this exposed the full Saturn rocket. And we were at a vantage point where we saw the liquid hydrogen tank. And I always was amused by the writing on it. It said, liquid hydrogen, no smoking. But this was the Apollo 11 Saturn V, and it was just a magnificent sight. So the morning of July 16th, my alarm went off at 4:30 in the morning, and we got in the car and drove to the NASA News Center. And there were several buses to take us to see the walkout of the Apollo 11 crew. And I was very lucky. There were only about 200 or so reporters who were there. So we drive through the security gate. We get to this spot outside the Manned Spacecraft Operations Building, the O&C building, and there's a roped-off area there. So the bus doors open up, and it's like a rugby scrum. Everybody's running there and elbowing to try and get best position around the rope. So we did pretty good. We were in like the 3rd row. Now, if you've seen the movie the Apollo 11 documentary, they show this crowd of reporters there. And I'm waiting for it to come out on DVD so I can see if I'm visible in that group, because I was there. So we stand there, And the first thing was Deke Slayton came out and was interviewed by a TV broadcaster. But then around 6:30 in the morning, in the distance, we could see into the MSOB. We see a white dot. And there's all kinds of scurrying around inside. This white dot comes forward. And it turned out that this was Neil Armstrong leading the procession. He walks out the door, and I'm snapping pictures as fast as I can. And this is what we saw. I took this picture of Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin walking out of the MSOB on July 16th, about 6:30 in the morning. And it happened very fast, but it was very emotional. At the time, we realized the importance of it, that this was kind of the last steps on Earth of these guys before they were going to the moon. Because they were going into the transfer van and then being taken to the pad and being put in the spacecraft. So that was the first shot. The second shot I got shows Collins and Aldrin, and behind them are two spacesuit techs. The one on the left is Joe Schmidt, who just passed away at age over 100. He suited up Alan Shepard, and I had some nice correspondence with him when he was about 96 years old. I sent him a copy of this picture, 2 copies of this picture. He sent one back to me that was autographed, and very, very precious to me. The other young guy there is Ron Woods.
Oh.
And Ronnie was with NASA for over 40 years, and also became a space artist. And through the years, again, I sent him a picture of this. At one point, he used this as his Facebook profile picture, and we've become friends. And I was very happy at the launch party for my book, which was April 6th at Cape Canaveral, that Ron and his wife were there. And it's always been interesting for us to compare our experience. He was inside the MSOB suiting up Buzz Aldrin, and I was outside elbowing these other reporters. So after this, we wanted to watch the launch, obviously. And so we got back on the NASA bus, but we got stuck in one of the world's biggest traffic jams. There were like 1 million people there. And even though we were on Kennedy Space Center grounds, there was still terrible traffic. And I remember just sitting there in the bus wondering, am I actually going to see the launch, or I'm going to be stuck in this damn bus? So eventually we made it back to the Launch Pad 39 Press Center. And we climbed up to the top, and this is the view at dawn of there. In the middle, way in the background, you can see the Saturn V. And those little figures at the base, those were hundreds of photographers setting up cameras to catch pictures of the launch. As the sun came up, this is what the Pad 39 press site looked like. There was a big grandstand there, and there were reporters and cameramen all over the place. But we saw a NASA bus that was going to the so-called VIP site, which is the other side of the VAB. And there, NASA had invited hundreds of dignitaries from all different kinds of fields. There were actors, and there were politicians, and there were military people. And so we decided to watch the launch from that VIP site. So we went on this bus, and among the dignitaries who were there, in the center, that's President Lyndon Johnson leaning over. And then above him and to the right, in a dark green uniform, that's General William Westmoreland, who was the Army Chief of Staff at the time and had been the commander of forces in Vietnam. There were all kinds of other people there. Sergeant Shriver was there, representing the Kennedy family. Johnny Carson and Ed McMahon, the TV personalities, were there. And I saw them. So, months before, the celestial mechanics dictated that the launch should be at 9:32 a.m. on July 16th. Now, the chances of that happening were very remote, because launches had scrubs, they had postponements, and so we didn't think it was very likely that they would get off at this time. But the countdown was what NASA calls nominal. which is kind of a weird word for normal. And at 9:32 a.m., there was ignition. So there were flames because flame detectors went out either side of the rocket. And what happened, it just seemed to sit there. And like I was kind of seriously concerned, was there a problem? Because the flames were shooting out and it wasn't doing anything. So it lifted off very, very slowly, much slower than, say, a shuttle launch. And I learned later that it took it 10 seconds just to clear the tower. And there's liftoff. So these are the pictures I took. These are pictures were from the VIP site. It was 3.5 miles away. Now you might say, why 3.5 miles away? Okay. Well, the problem was the Saturn V rocket was really a big bomb. And if something went wrong and it exploded, that was the closest distance you could get without certain annihilation. So that's dictated the location of the press site and the VIP site, as well as the VAB and the Launch Control Center. So it lifts off like this, and there's silence. No sound. But then, as it starts to clear the tower, the sound waves start hitting us. And I don't know if any of you else have seen a Saturn V launch, but it's a physical sensation. The sound is so loud it's been compared to 100 locomotives. The sound pounds against your chest. You feel it pounding against you. The vibration rocks the ground. And as the rocket rises, you actually feel the heat from the 7.5 million pounds of thrust. It was just an overwhelming experience. So it took off very, very slowly and then very gradually gained speed. And then about 2 minutes later, it was just a speck of light in the sky. By the way, the movie First Man, which in many ways is a great movie, totally gets the launch wrong because it shows them launching into a cloudy sky. And you can see there that it was a nice blue sky with just a few scattered clouds. So in the last few minutes, let me just talk about what some of the lessons of Apollo are. One is to be bold. And there are 4 clear examples of that, and we'll go briefly through each one of them. One was the setting the goal of landing on the moon to begin with. Second was the approach they used to landing on the moon, lunar orbit rendezvous. Third was the concept of all-up testing that George Muller was responsible for. And then finally was the decision to send Apollo 8 around the moon. So President Kennedy sent a memo a few days after Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, and a few days after the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a big embarrassment for the United States. A secret memo at the time, which has been declassified, to Lyndon Johnson, his vice president and head of the Space Council. And in this letter, he specifically states, what project can we do where we are almost guaranteed to beat the Russians? Is it an Earth orbiting laboratory? Is it landing an unmanned satellite on the moon? What can we do? And so there was a big flurry of activity, again, all of this secret, and Johnson came back about a week later with a letter stating that landing a man on the moon is something that we could do, that there was a very good chance that we could beat the Russians. And these series of 2 memos, I think, are very instructive as to how the moon race got going, that it was definitely a product of the Cold War. So President Kennedy made the announcement just a month later, in joint session of Congress, May 25th, 1961, and then reiterated it more strongly in September 1962 in his famous speech at Rice University. And again, it's almost become a cliche, but we chose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard. Now, at that point, the total U.S. space experience was 15 minutes in a suborbital flight by Alan Shepard, okay? We couldn't even send a guy in orbit. And here he's planning to go to the moon within the end of the decade. This was very audacious and very bold. And so the next question was, how do we get there? So there were 3 competing proposals. One was direct ascent, in which a huge rocket to be called Nova would land a spacecraft on the moon, and then that spacecraft in its entirety would fly back to the Earth. The problem with this was that NOVA was more advanced than the technology at the time, and there's no way that we could have beaten the deadline. The two other approaches were Earth orbit rendezvous and lunar orbit rendezvous. Earth orbit rendezvous was favored by von Braun and the people at Marshall, where they would have two Saturn V launches and join together two spacecraft to go to the moon, and then land on the moon and then bring the whole thing back. And for a while, this was the leading proposal to get us to the moon. But then a group at Langley, the most prominent of which was an engineer called John Hobolt, came up with this idea of lunar orbit rendezvous. Now, at first, this seemed crazy. And because it involved two spacecraft rendezvousing in orbit around the moon. I mean, at that point, we hadn't even done any rendezvous at all, let alone in lunar orbit. And so it was dismissed. But John Hobolt was very persistent, and they showed by very good engineering arguments that you could cut the weight that you had to land on the moon by more than a half if you did it by lunar orbit rendezvous. So it saved in weight, it saved in fuel, it saved in time schedule, and it saved in money. And eventually, to make a long story short, this was the approach adopted to get to the moon, lunar orbit rendezvous. So for a long time, John Hobolt was a voice in the wilderness. And it's interesting that he was invited by von Braun personally to attend the landing at Mission Control in Houston as a recognition of the important role that he had played in this. Now, the other decision that speeded up the schedule was the idea of all-up testing. If you look at testing of the Saturn I rocket, von Braun did what they normally did. They tested a first stage first, and then they added a second stage, and then they were going to add the payload. Okay, so sequential testing. But Miller, who had worked with ICBMs and stuff like that, believed in this idea of all-up testing, that the best type of testing would be if you tested everything together, because you would have a much better idea how the integrated vehicle worked itself. And so the people with sequential testing, they were going to order up to 20 Saturn V rockets, and they would not fly any men on a Saturn V rocket until at least the 10th flight. And so by choosing all-up testing, they saved a lot of time and money. The final bold decision was the idea to send Apollo 8 to lunar orbit. Now, originally Apollo 8 was supposed to be a test of the lunar module in a high Earth orbit. As time came for it, the command and service module was ready, the Saturn V was ready, but they had no lunar module to test because there had been major delays in testing and development of the lunar module. So George Low came up with the ingenious idea of sending Apollo 8 around the moon and testing all different types of parameters to get to the moon and not waiting for a lunar module, which would have taken months. And again, that decision played a major role in us reaching the goal in time. So lesson number 2 is no bucks, no Buck Rogers. Okay? And again, no bucks is no budget money. No Buck Rogers is performing tasks in space. So it's interesting, in 1966 was the peak of the NASA budget. In 1966, the budget for NASA was $5.9 billion. Now that would be, in current dollars, 2018 dollars, a budget of $45.6 billion. The current NASA budget is around $20 billion. So we're spending less than half of what we were spending at the height of Apollo. And you can see on this graph here what that looked like. That there were sharp cutbacks, mainly due to the Vietnam War in the late 60s. And NASA was left with a much lower budget than they had anticipated. Now, what was the result of this? Well, there were... Let's see, what's the matter here? Okay, so there were 3 main results. First of all, Apollos 18, 19, and 20 were canceled. They already had a lot of the hardware, but they saved on the operational costs of doing those missions. And at least some of the NASA brass, such as George Gilruth, were afraid by doing these later missions that NASA would lose more astronauts. He thought that they had had 6 successful landings, and let's call it quits. The other thing that these budget cuts did is they reduced the Apollo Applications Project that Muller had suggested, which would have been a series of orbiting laboratories, early space stations, to just a single station, which became the Skylab program. And with Skylab program, they used one of the Saturn V's that was left. But because of budget stringencies, again, they did not provide any reboost capability for Skylab. And so Skylab fell back to Earth in July 1979, and the US lost a wonderful opportunity to have a small space station in orbit many years sooner. The other thing that the budget cuts did is it forced changes in the space shuttle. And NASA bought in cheap on the space shuttle. The only way they could sell it to President Nixon was to have relatively low development costs. And what they did was they added on solid rocket boosters, which cannot be throttled down. And they came up with this kind of crazy Rube Goldberg type design where you had reusable main engines on the orbiter, but then a separate external tank and fuel tank. So the cost of this lack of reusability was schedule delays, increased operational costs, and probably eventually the loss of two of the shuttles. Certainly Challenger. The alternative would have been to spend more money in developing it and develop completely reusable shuttle. Lesson number 3 is be inclusive. And the first Mercury astronauts, the original 7, were all white male test pilots. Now, it probably made sense to have the first crew being test pilots, and this was a decision that President Eisenhower specifically made, because no one knew what to expect. But it became clear by the end of the Apollo program that NASA needed more skills than just test pilots. And so, for example, Jack Schmitt was added to Apollo 17 as a geologist. And then when it came time for shuttle operations, there was a whole sea change in NASA philosophy. And they realized that they needed to be more inclusive in terms of shuttle crews. So the 35 new guys, TFNG, that were selected for the space shuttle included women, it included African Americans and Asians, and was much more a diverse group of people. Now, this diversity and inclusion continued further on, and Charlie Bolden, on upper left there, was one of the first African American astronauts, and later became the administrator of NASA. And at one point, he was the administrator of NASA. His deputy, Dava Newman, was a woman, and the head of Johnson Space Center then, Ellen Ochoa, was a Hispanic woman. And the other thing would be women pilots. And again, it was sadness to hear the passing of Jerry Cobb a few days ago, but she could have been the first woman astronaut. But in those days, women did not ride rockets. Women were secretaries or nurses, and there was some terrible discrimination going on. But this has ended with the appointment of Space Shuttle Commanders Eileen Collins and Pam Melroy. And if any of you have had the chance to meet Eileen Collins, she's a remarkable woman. And then finally, another inclusivity was that when astronaut Sally Ride, who was the first woman to go into space for the US in 1983, passed away, it was revealed that she had a female life partner, Tam O'Shaughnessy, and that she was the first LGBT astronaut. The next lesson is be prepared. And the NASA flight crews believed greatly in simulations. And it's very clear that simulations prevented Apollo 11 from aborting when all these computer alarms went off, because they had run into this during simulations, that the computers were overwhelmed by the data. And so that they had a lunar module trainer, which is on the left there, and the picture on the top shows Neil and Buzz in the lunar module simulator. And down below are is the test team. And so Neil and Buzz are on the left, and then on the right in the vest is Gene Kranz, the famous flight director. Now, they had very specific rules for the launch and also for the flight itself. And these are copies of the flight rules and the flight plan. That flight plan I actually picked up at the News Center and later had Buzz autograph it. And is one of my prized possessions. And the final lesson is never give up. And both in the flight, NASA flights, and also in my own case, I think persistence is a tremendous virtue. NASA and the lunar program faced some very important setbacks, and the most tragic of which, of course, was the Apollo 1 fire, in which on January 27, 1967, Grissom, White, and Chaffee died due to a fire during a test on the ground. And this really caused NASA to rethink the design of the Apollo command module, and perhaps Frank Borman deserves a lot of the credit for getting the command module fixed and solving some of the problems. He was one of the people in charge of the recovery from the Apollo fire. The other almost disaster was the explosion aboard the service module of Apollo 13 on the way to the moon. And this was a very scary situation. And the astronauts, but especially the people in ground control there, were instrumental in getting the men back safely. And many call this NASA's finest hour. Okay, let's see. And in my own case, it was also a matter of not giving up. As I mentioned before, it was not easy to get the NASA press pass, and we persisted until we were able to get a press pass from NASA. Another example of that is at the NASA News Center, I had picked up an Apollo lunar orbit chart, this big long chart showing their path over the moon. So in 1993, I sent it to Neil Armstrong to get it autographed. He was living in a farm near Lebanon, Ohio at that point, and I had an address. I sent it to Neil Armstrong, and I got it back, and there was a big refused written on the envelope. Because he was very rarely signing autographs then. But I decided not to give up, so I did something which would not work today, but I sent it to Neil, care of the astronaut office in Houston. I realized it was a long shot. And months went by, and I didn't see the map, so I thought it was lost. So on July 20th, 1994, the 25th anniversary of the moon landing, I walk out to my mailbox, I open it up, and inside there's this big envelope, and it's postmarked Cincinnati, Ohio. And my hands start to shake. I very carefully open it up, and inside was this lunar orbit chart, and it was signed "Best wishes to Dr. Dave Chudwin, Neil Armstrong." Now, that was one of the last things that he had signed, because as of July 20th, 1994, he stopped signing autographs, with extremely rare exceptions. He was happy to pose for pictures with people, but no autographs. He had been advised by Charles Lindbergh, the great aviator, don't give autographs. Now, from when he started to 1994, he estimated that he might have signed as much as 100,000 autographs through the years. But after 1994, he quit. And so for me to get this on the 25th anniversary of the moon landing was really an incredible experience. And this is, of all my memorabilia, this is definitely the most precious.
I
So,
have that locked up. I
I hope you have it locked up
Yeah.
somewhere.
It's archivally, it's framed with archival materials, and, you know, UV resistant glass, and I spent a fortune getting it framed, but it's in good shape. So the final episode of, final incident of not giving up is this book. So 5 years ago, I put a series up on Facebook of a lot of the pictures I had taken back in 1969. They were color Kodachrome slides, and I had them professionally scanned by a photo lab. And I decided for the anniversary that I was going to put up a series of Facebook posts. I didn't realize that it would end up being 73 daily posts on Facebook. But after this, a number of people said to me, "You've got a book there." And I looked back and I realized that I still had a lot of the notebooks that I had taken, you know, kind of a diary I had taken, and other materials. So 4 years ago, I decided to write a book. Now, a lot of people say, "Oh, I'm going to write a book." I never realized what I was getting into. It took 2.5 years to actually write it, and it took additional time to find an agent. And it's very, very hard for a new author to get a book agent. And then it took us time to find a publisher, and it took us a long time to edit through it. I had a wonderful editor at my publisher. It's a small English publisher called Lid Publishing, but my editor there was terrific. But we went back and forth. It took forever to pick out which pictures to use or not. In the book are 85 pictures, but I could have had 180. And so I had to go through all of those. And some of the pictures we didn't use are on a website that we just set up. It's not totally completed, but it's davidchudwin.com. It's just my name. And some of the rejected pictures are there. And it was really tough picking the pictures. It's like, which of your children do you like the best? And so it took forever. And at times I despaired of, you know, that we would find a publisher for this. So last August 24th, in the morning, I signed a contract for the book. And then sadly, that afternoon, my wife passed away. She had had MS for many years and had been quite ill, but the timing was extremely surprising. So it was both the best day of my life and the worst day of my life. And this book is dedicated to her memory. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed hearing the story about this, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.